Just wanted to welcome you all, give the briefest of introductions to Energy Action Network. We are hosting this meeting. As most of you know, EAN is two things. We are both a small nonprofit organization that does a lot of data analysis and shares with the state the best information we have on how we're doing on meeting our energy and climate goals and commitments. But then we also are a really broad network of folks in the state who are interested in what's happening in energy and climate. And as part of that, we have a number of different working groups and coalitions. One of those, which is hosting this meeting, is the Municipal Energy Code Collaborative. And a goal of that collaborative is to create a model of accountability for residential energy code compliance in leading Vermont municipalities that are committed to energy savings and climate goals. And the idea is that that could then be scaled and adapted to others. EAN doesn't advocate for any particular policies, but we do bring together groups like this to have conversations. And very grateful for the leadership of the co-chairs of this group, who are Zach Tyler from Energy Futures Group and Bettina Miguez from City of South Burlington. Hi, Bettina. I wanted to really quickly tell you what our agenda for today is and sort of what our trajectory is before we get started. So we're going to spend about 15 minutes today with just an update from the municipal working group and the activities that have been going on. And then we're so happy to have Ian Finlayson with us today from Massachusetts. He's the Deputy Director of Building Codes and Policy for the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. And he's going to share with us a brief presentation on Massachusetts energy code implementation and third-party raters. He's got some information that'll be really interesting to us. And then we're going to spend the final part of this meeting with some Q&A for Ian and any clarifications. That doesn't give us time to have a conversation internally about how this might show up in Vermont. So I'm going to send an invitation after this meeting to all of you for a second meeting on June 8th, where we can dive into that conversation. So today we'll really spend the time learning from Ian since we have him here with us, and then we'll have some time next month for a deeper conversation. So with all of that, as there's presentations happening, please put your questions in the chat and we'll get around to as many of them as we can. And I will hand over to Zach.
Thanks, Cara. Yeah, thanks, Ian, for being here. Thanks to everybody for attending. Looks like we've got a great turnout, which is awesome to see. Just a little bit more by way of background. Richard and I sort of pitched this idea at the EAN Summit last year after a couple years of participating in energy code working groups that were facilitated by the Public Service Department. And it's pretty clear that there's not an interest in administering or enforcing the energy code at the state level at this point in time. And so, we've been thinking through and discussing with stakeholders how we might be able to ensure compliance in ways outside of sort of just training and education. And we came up with this idea that perhaps there's a path where municipalities that are interested could voluntarily administer and enforce the energy code, particularly in partnership with third-party energy auditors that have explicit expertise in building science and energy code related issues. While they may not be trained specifically on sort of all the Vermont code specifics, they certainly have building science background, ability to conduct diagnostic tests that are part of the energy code. And so that's what this group was developed for, to sort of get stakeholders interested in this concept, talking and figure out if there's a path forward for Vermont here. We had a smaller group meeting in January to talk about the existing statutory language around the energy code in Vermont and whether municipalities sort of have the authority to administer and enforce the energy code. And my takeaway from that meeting was maybe. It's a bit of a gray area. And I think in light of that, Representative Campbell had introduced a bill for this session, and one of the elements of that bill was to make it clear that municipalities do explicitly have the authority, if interested, to administer and enforce the energy code. I'm looking, I don't see Representative Campbell on. Scott, are you here? And I'm just not seeing
No,
you.
I don't see him on the list either.
Okay. Uh, hopefully Representative Campbell will join. He was going to provide an update on kind of where things stand with that bill. Absent that, I think we can kind of jump into it with Ian. I'll just say that there's a bit of a gray area. Municipalities may have the authority already to administer and enforce the energy code. Obviously, there's only so far we can go with this concept if that authority does not exist. And so that was sort of step one of this group, was to establish what that looks like in the current statutory language and get some clarity around that. And so there's still some ongoing work there, but yeah, we had reached out to Ian to have him bring the Massachusetts perspective. I think this idea really was inspired by what's happened in Massachusetts over the last 15 plus years, I think. And so I worked in Massachusetts for many years as an evaluator, have known Ian for quite some time, and Ian's been around doing this stuff and sort of leading the charge on the stretch code in Massachusetts for as long as I've been working in this space. And Massachusetts has this exact setup in many ways where builders and contractors work with PERS raters, which is a form of third-party energy auditor, to help verify compliance with the energy code. So with that, I think I'll pass it to Ian to sort of give us an overview of how that works in Massachusetts. And as Cara said, I think we'd like to take our time today to in the Q&A discussion to answer questions we might have for Ian, to get a better understanding of how these relationships work, how things have progressed over time in Massachusetts, and maybe save the Vermont specifics for a follow-up. But yeah, Ian, thank you again for being here. Really appreciate you sharing your insights with all of us as we work to try and make this happen in Vermont.
Great. Thank you, Zach. And hello, everyone. And I have to say that Richard Fahey had a role in us getting started with the stretch code way back in 2007, 2008. So I feel like it's all coming full circle a little bit here. But I thought I should embarrass Richard right at the start. I've got a few slides. I'm going to try and show you about 10 slides. Give you the context in Massachusetts, because obviously there are some differences, and then talk about sort of the logistics, how this works in Mass. And then hopefully that covers some of your questions, but I want lots of time for any other questions you might have. So let's see if I can figure out the screen share here. Okay, can you see this? Yeah, great. Okay, so yeah, let me get started. And sorry, it's struggling on my side. Okay, so the boring stuff first. We didn't just decide to do this on our own here in Massachusetts. We follow direction from our legislature. So I don't know anything about legislative efforts in Vermont or whether this is voluntary, but the context matters for Massachusetts at least. So we had already started thinking about a stretch code in 2007 because we had some municipalities in the state that really wanted to do more than they were being allowed to do. And our code in Massachusetts at the time said, you have to adopt the statewide code and no ifs or buts. You don't get to do more than that if you're a city or a town. So that led to part of what was a much bigger legislative effort called the Green Communities Act that passed in 2008. the naming of that act comes from the Green Communities Program, which was established as sort of a program to give technical assistance and grant funding to cities and towns in return for doing green things, which included climate planning, thinking about fleets, thinking about municipal buildings. And during the 2-year conversation around this legislation, we got included in that having a stretch code option for these cities or towns to adopt. So that stretch code piece went through our state board, the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, but in consultation with where I work now, the Department of Energy Resources. And essentially, it split our energy code into 2 tracks, the minimum base code and then this optional stretch code. That has changed more recently with new language in 2022, which took all of the stretch code and moved it over to the Energy Office, DOER, and asked for a new net zero tier. So we're now up to 3 options for energy code for cities and towns, but they can't create their own version. It has to be one of those 3. But for this conversation, I think it's that first step, the 2008 legislation that led to a 2009 stretch code, that is probably most relevant. So here's a map of Massachusetts in end of year 2009. And at that point, we had introduced our stretch code, and it's been adopted by 2 leading cities, Newton and Cambridge. And then hopefully you can see the sort of gray towns and cities on the map. They, in a little bit of a surprise to us, were all the other cities and towns that were like, hey, this is a really interesting idea. We like this idea of being a green community. We want to do this too. So to be honest, we thought we'd maybe get between 12 and 20 communities willing to do this, because they were the folks that had been asking for something like this prior to the legislation. And we were pleasantly surprised by how many cities and towns kind of jumped into this. Now, that said, the least enthusiastic people back in 2007, when we started this, were the municipal building officials. They felt at the time, because we did a survey and talked to them, that they were getting the short end of the stick. The energy code in particular, also fire code a little bit, was getting more complicated every 3-year cycle. They had no control over that. They weren't getting a lot of training. They weren't getting a lot of support. They wanted that training not just for the building officials themselves, but also for the people on the other side of the counter, the household that wanted to build their own house, all the way up to the big subdivision developer who was mostly working in other states. They felt like they were being asked to explain the code to everybody, learn themselves, stay on top of everything. And it was just a little bit of an unfunded mandate. So they, when we said, oh, we're thinking about doing something here, maybe making a stretch code, they said, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to really want to pay attention to the residential side of this. We've got to make it easier. And at the same time, while we want support and training, we do not want to lose our authority to third-party raters. So that sounds a little bit different to me than Vermont, but I thought I should give you that context because it sort of explains what we did from there on. So how did we include HERS raters and how do they fit in? Well, the big advantage that we had in Massachusetts was we already had a utility program under what's now called Mass Save, where we had new construction incentives when builders used HERS raters to do ratings. So we very much borrowed from that idea. And the idea was not to have the HERS rater be replacing the municipal official, but to have the HERS rater be hired by and paid by the builder or the developer to then help them demonstrate that they were producing a better building and that the utility could expect efficiency, savings, other benefits as a result of that. So this is essentially the process that we started with, agreed on in 2008, and that's continued through to today. So essentially, the HERS rater is brought in by the builder or developer, hopefully early on in the design stage, absolutely in the permit stage, because our construction documents requirements now require that HERS rating to be submitted for any new residential project or any major retrofit. So large additions, large alterations to existing buildings, if they have residential units in them, also require a HERS rating. Then the HERS rater does the key testing, the diagnostic testing on the building, and that then puts together the final HERS rating, which again is submitted for with the rest of the construction document, the submittals for a certificate of occupancy. That is inspected and approved by the municipal building official in Massachusetts, and they issue the certificate of occupancy. In other states, the HERS rater plays that role. And then finally, the HERS rater sends the final rating to the ResNet registry, where it's publicly published and can be used to help sell a home or to provide sort of more information to buyers and also to municipalities. So that's how it works. Midway through this process, in the 2012 National Code process, the HERS pathway was adopted into the base code, except that not as the ResNet HERS pathway. It was adopted as the Energy Rating Index, or ERI path. And we were part of the conversation around that as the first state to have adopted HERS in code. But folks at the IECC said, we can't just allow a private entity, even if it's a nonprofit like ResNet, to have exclusive right to this code. We're going to write it in a generic way, hence Energy Rating Index, which then allows potential competitors to have their own index. And so the request came to us, why are you keeping going with HERS? Why aren't you just using the ERI language that's in the model code? And just to be clear, like ERI and HERS, maybe you already know this, both essentially use HERS raters. No alternative to ResNet's really emerged at the national scale. So it did make us sort of step back and think about, well, why do we want HERS and not ERI? And this, I think, is relevant for the situation in Vermont. We were selling stretch code at that time to cities and towns as a way not just of being green and doing something, but also as consumer protection, and really ensuring that the building that got designed is the building that got built, and that a better building was getting built. So when this ERI question came up, we realized that HERS essentially has two big advantages. One is that if it is an official HERS rating through ResNet, then there is a quality assurance, quality control aspect where the HERS rater's work gets double checked, where the final ratings get published nationally and can be found, including by the municipality or by the energy office. And so if there's anything unusual there, there's a mechanism to check and improve compliance. So again, that was a key moment for us. Since then, we've kind of tried to build on that. So we are continuing to use HERS ratings, but also continuing to think about how do we streamline that compliance aspect and assist municipalities as well as our policy goals at the state level with getting good results. And so it started out as thinking about code compliance, but it's also become a key part of our utility incentive program, that having a HERS rater on the project allows reporting to the municipal building official or to the municipality on what got built, but also allows reporting to the energy efficiency program on what the energy savings are for each of those projects. In that way, the HERS rater, who's got to put together a model anyway of the building, can easily provide information like this certificate on the right here that's telling us what compliance path was used, what fuel use is in the building, and making it easier for the municipality to show compliance. But equally, it can also show the utility, what fuel was used, what the expected annual energy savings are, and then sort of streamline the incentive process. So that's kind of where we are today with that. In terms of the transition from 2009 to today, this is sort of HERS ratings in Massachusetts in one slide. And you can see that we started with what at the time we thought were fairly ambitious HERS ratings, and then have learned over time that we can bring those down as the builders and HERS raters get more proficient at meeting these standards. The green bar there is the new specialized or net zero code option in Massachusetts. And you kind of see that's evolved. And then similarly, at the municipal level, there's been an evolution as well. So in that early slide, I showed you the first two cities and towns that adopted, and sort of our sense of, that this is probably working well is that now we have over 300 cities and towns, all but 49, I believe it is now, cities and towns in Massachusetts have either adopted the stretch code or that newer specialized code option. And so in all of these towns that are not white on the map, a HERS rating is required for a single family or a small residential development. And then in those darker blue shaded towns with specialized code, we've moved to require passive house standards for larger multifamily projects. So HERS rating for the small or single family homes, townhouses, two-family type construction, and then bigger multifamily buildings going to passive house. And that dark blue now represents about a third of the state, and the stretch code represents a little over 60% of the state. So we're down well below 10% not using this requirement. And interestingly, even in those white communities that are on our base code, about 50% of the permits in those towns are also using HERS ratings just on a voluntary basis, because that's what you're doing elsewhere in the state. So why change your method? So last slide is just a reminder to myself, but also to this audience, that we couldn't have done this and we couldn't have sustained this without also having some support. And so I want to flag our Green Communities Division for being the fiscal and technical support to cities and towns that sort of allows this to happen. So I said a lot there. I said it very fast. I couldn't see you while I was talking, but I'm going to stop now, and maybe we can have more of a conversation.
Thanks so much, Ian. Really cool to see the progress over the years there. We have a couple questions in the chat I can relay for you, and then I think we'll open it up to the room. A few points before that, just to add some color context for the audience and perhaps for you as well, Ian. Many municipalities in Vermont do not have code officials. So I think that's a key distinction here, and something that we're trying to think through and work through. And I think also as part of this, in order to be sort of flexible. We're not necessarily wedded to HERS ratings and HERS raters, although they perhaps are the most well equipped to perform some of the code compliance verification. But we've been wondering if other, like BPI certifications might also be a fit with some supplemental code training, though I think your point about the third-party oversight from ResNet of HERS raters is a real value add. And the last point I just wanted to make is that we do in Vermont also have subsidies for HERS raters through Efficiency Vermont's residential new construction program. So that element that Massachusetts leaned into is already available and relevant in Vermont as well. So I just wanted to add those couple things. Let's see if I can go through these in order.
Just for fun on the first one, we do have some hempcrete projects now in Massachusetts. So someone asked about hemp. We allow it, and there's people using it.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I'm glad you can see those. I'll read through them, Ian, and maybe we can just fire through these. So what was the rationale behind the mandate to do Passive House Institute or FIAS certification for 12,000 square feet and up?
Yeah. So we knew that the legislature was talking about a gas ban or a net zero code. That was a discussion that evolved over about 4 years. And so at the Energy Office, we asked for funding to do a study. Like if we're going to take on something big like this, we have enough trade groups and lobbyists and interest groups in Massachusetts. We're going to need to have a good, strong position. And so we were given over $1 million to kind of study this. And we spent 2 years with some really good consultants doing a deep dive into 12 different building types, multiple sizes of single family and multifamily buildings. And we were looking for that sweet spot where the code could be stringent enough to make all electric space heating in particular cheaper or at least competitive with gas, because we have a lot of gas distribution in Massachusetts. And our feeling was if we could downsize the heating requirement, then that would be better served there's a tipping point where it's better served by all electric heat pumps than sort of blasting with gas furnaces or boilers. And so we wanted to find that tipping point. And so when we did that analysis, for a single family home, Passive House was a significant additional cost. But for multifamily, it was actually very cost effective. And the bigger the multifamily got, the more cost effective it was. And so once you're, at a 100-unit multifamily building, it's not actually cheaper to do a HERS rating because you've got to test every unit or sample every 8 units. And Passive House, you're more or less able to do something similar. But with the air tightness improvements and the better ventilation, and we were in COVID right then when we were doing the study, there were a lot of ancillary benefits to Passive House. And we were seeing that the cost effectiveness was good. And we field tested that with 7 affordable housing developments where we asked them to price out non-stretch code and Passive House, and then gave them an incremental cost of $4,000 a unit. And they were able to get to Passive House for that amount of money. And we're like, okay, well, it makes sense cost effectively. We get far better results. There are all these ancillary benefits like noise pollution, smoke infiltration from neighbors, all these other things that improve. And so it was a fairly easy decision in the end. But only because we had this new top tier and because we had time to kind of do the homework.
Great, thank you. And can you speak to where the code officials in Massachusetts work? Are they municipal employees or are they state employees?
Yeah, so the code is developed at the state level, and we do have literally a dozen state building officials that cover things like our MBTA public transit system and anomalies like that, fairgrounds. But almost all of our building officials are municipal employees. We have over 800 when they're all hired. That might be down to like 700 and something right now because there is a labor shortage of building officials. But essentially, they represent the municipality. And so in Vermont, even where you maybe don't have a building official, I still think the municipality has to be represented somehow. And I assume your permitting is also a municipal thing. So yeah, so we have our Green Communities Division interfacing with the town or city as a whole, and then our team more directly with building officials. But very much we see them as like the municipal representatives.
One follow-up question to that I would have, and I would encourage folks, unless Cara or Bettina disagree, if you have follow-up questions to any of these, raise your hand and, let's make this a discussion. Smaller rural type towns in Massachusetts, Ian, do they all have their own code official typically, or is that something that's done like regionally at all in Massachusetts? I'm just curious. That's a resource issue in Vermont, and so curious if that's if that plays out in Massachusetts at all, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, if you go south out of Vermont into like Berkshire County, Franklin County, Hampshire County in Massachusetts, you'll find that, a lot of towns share schools and share building officials, both fire officials and building officials. Just the size of the community, it doesn't make sense. They don't have that many permits on an annual basis. And so, yeah, it's quite common for one building official to say cover 4 communities. There's usually some openings at any particular point in time as well. And so then building officials will kind of help out another community. And I mean, it was a resource issue back in 2007. It's still a resource issue now for municipal budgets. And so one of the attractions that we had here was bringing in an energy specialist, take some of the burden off the municipality at a time when everyone is predicting that the energy code and the fire code, for that matter, is going to get more complex. So I think that was where we had support. At the time, though, there was a lot of concern about going fully third party because the municipality didn't want to lose control. And so we made sure that the municipal official is the one that decides what inspections need to be done and does the final sign off. That might be a little different in Vermont. I feel like Colorado and some of the states around the sort of Mountain West might be more analogous to Vermont in that respect.
Yeah. Thank you. Question from Chris Grand. What if a building fails the HERS rating? Do you take any steps to prevent collusion between builders and HERS raters?
Yeah, I mean, that was a frequent question early on. It's like, oh, what happens if it doesn't work? So it's a good question. So, I mean, one reason why we require the preliminary HERS rating at permitting is that, that gets you a lot of the way there. If there's a plan in place, if the builder knows that they've got to submit this and they've got to meet the performance level, then that makes a huge difference. But then if they come in and do their final testing and it's not passing, they don't get the certificate of occupancy. And obviously that puts a lot of pressure on the HERS rater to be like, you're the person standing between this developer and getting their certificate of occupancy. And that was one of the key reasons why we stayed with the ResNet HERS and then required certification with Passive House instead of ERI or any kind of people were talking about the idea of being verifiable but not requiring the full certification. We were like, no, we need the full certification because that almost protects the raider. They can say, look, I can't bend the rules for you. I can lose my license. I'm getting inspected. So that backstop we found to be quite credible and quite valuable. We have had a couple of cases, across 16 years now. I think we've had maybe 4 or 5 cases where HERS raiders have lost their license because there have been incidents where buildings have essentially fudged the numbers. Most recently, we had somebody thinking they could just, copy and paste a lower number on top of the higher number, and that, nobody would be able to check that. ResNet has forensic software that scans their HERS ratings so they can see that somebody copied and pasted. And so we're able to leverage that kind of quality assurance step as a result of that.
Thank you. Do you have any sense how much it would cost to build a 1800 or, typical single family home using these codes?
Well, I mean, that's why I showed that chart of how our HERS ratings have reduced over time, reduced the HERS rating over time. I mean, I think the question is the incremental cost usually, because you have to build to something, right? So, most of the increases in cost recently have been, tariff related, inflation related, the cost of borrowing money with interest rates being higher. So yeah, pick your baseline for what you think it costs to build that house, land price as well. And then what we look at is the incremental cost, if you have a HERS rater versus not. In a lot of situations, we find that having a HERS rater, or particularly having a Passive House consultant early on, is going to change some design decisions. And a lot of times that makes the building cheaper to build. If you take out a dormer window, that's going to improve your energy efficiency. It's also going to be cheaper to build. You're going to have a simpler roof line. Maybe you can put solar there instead and save even more money. So we do analyses. You can look on our website and you can see some cost studies, but they are looking at incremental cost of base code, which doesn't require HERS, stretch code that requires HERS, and then for multifamily Passive House for those bigger buildings.
Great. Richard, why don't you come off mute and ask your savings question?
Yeah. Given that I see folks from at least Efficiency Vermont on the call here. By the way, thanks, Ian. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and information here. Could you just talk about how the utilities claim savings and specifically justify supporting new construction efforts? My understanding is that they're claiming savings relative to the statewide baseline, even if the local jurisdiction has adopted one of the higher tiers. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That was a key question, again, relatively early on, I think like 2010. It came up that if you have some cities and towns in the state that are adopting a higher tier stretch code and some that are not, then do you have a baseline in one town that's based on their code in that town, and then a different baseline in a different town that's on a weaker code? And we got together with the program administrators in Massachusetts and we're like, well, this makes no sense. Like, if you change the baseline when a town does, a good thing, becomes a green community, then that becomes a disincentive for construction in that town, because then they get it looks like they're creating less savings because they're building a home off a higher baseline. And so the utility can give them less incentive to do that. So we reached an agreement very early on that we should have a statewide baseline, and that then if a town or city is moving the market by adopting our Green Communities program, by adopting our stretch code, rather than being penalized for that, they're increasing the likelihood of savings across more projects. So they're kind of growing the likelihood of program participation, and also having some spillover impact on buildings that are not in the program. And so over time, we've gone from a utility program that was very focused on building by building, what are the savings versus baseline, to more of a, well, let's look at the program buildings and what they're saving, but also the spillover, and then now more to an explicit market transformation. So the utilities, they were struggling with incentives for multifamily new construction in finding savings. We asked them to take a little bit of a leap with Passive House, because at the time that was seen as very ambitious. And now, the vast majority of the market in Massachusetts for a new multifamily, maybe up to 80% of new construction where mass save incentives are available, is participating in that program. And so it's really paid off, I think. They're getting market transformation credit, they're getting significant project level savings, and they're seeing spillover. So it's been a very good news story, I think. Very cost-effective programs now in new construction.
Thanks, Ian. Let's see. I should have just been calling on folks the whole time. Enrique, you have a question about Passive House. Do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Zach. Basically, I mean, what I want to see what was the rationale behind the mandatory mandate to put Passive House as a building code for 12,000 square feet and up. And I think one of the reasons was what you mentioned, the lowering of the thermal loads. But also, I mean, since Passive House certification requires the third-party verification, that liberates the towns from that official or that person. Is that something else that will do?
Yeah, that's a good point. There were a lot of different drivers for why we ended up with Passive House, but in communicating it to cities and towns, we have stressed the fact that as these buildings get more airtight and more efficient, the risk of moisture issues in the envelope increases. So just from a building science perspective, you're increasing the risk of, if moisture gets in, it not getting out quickly enough. And so inspections become more important, not less important. And so one of the advantages of the Passive House certification is the detailed look at that. And they do what's called hydrothermal analysis of the walls to check moisture flow, a step beyond what a hose redder is doing. There's also more care and attention around the ventilation, which again, coming out of COVID, we just saw as massively important. And so those things, we're essentially increasing the technical knowledge and testing needed in a way that is, like you said, taking the burden off of the city or the town. Because it's hard enough to have a building official in the first place, but then to expect them to be knowledgeable on things like hydrothermal analysis and three-dimensional thermal bridge analysis, it's just not realistic for someone who's a municipal official, and for consistent implementation across 350 cities and towns. We just weren't going to see that. So yes, I think there's been this longer term trend of saying yes, the energy code is getting more sophisticated. It can be quite simple in terms of the modeling, in terms of verifying compliance, but then you have to bring in an energy expert to do that part of the work. Does that address your question?
Yep, thank you much.
Want to take a quick pause, see Representative Campbell is on. Scott, are you available to come off mute and maybe give us a quick update on municipal authority from a legislative perspective?
Sure. Sorry, I'm in the car. Had an unexpected trip to Massachusetts, and so I didn't even know.
Oh, how timely! We're talking all Massachusetts. So
thinking about moving here, actually. Not really. But I would say that oh my gosh, we're so many steps behind Massachusetts in this effort. So I had a bill have a bill in the Vermont legislature this year to take a few baby steps in this direction, basically by enhancing or stimulating voluntary compliance with energy codes. We have mandatory energy codes, as I'm sure all of you know. I'm seeing Tim Yando's statement here, or comment. But of course, we have no enforcement. We have no penalty. It's all self-certification. And we don't have building officials in almost every town. We have a few towns that have building officials. You don't get building permits. You get zoning permits. So we're really structurally just way behind what Massachusetts is able to do. The bill that it now looks like it's probably not going to get taken up in the Senate was a House bill. It's not going to get taken up in the Senate committee. The Senate committee is officially done, although they will be meeting, I think, to consider bills that other committees in the Senate are working on. But I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Anyway, the strategy of that bill that I introduced was to leverage the residential contractor registry, which is not a licensing mechanism, but just merely registration, to raise the profile of that registry in the public's mind, make the website far more usable, and thereby encourage builders to take advantage of the optional and voluntary certifications that are available to attach to their registration, and use that as sort of a market signals mechanism to get more builders to learn about energy codes and, incidentally, about moisture flows and building science. Not incidentally at all, in my view. I mean, that's really the whole point. We have lots of training opportunities in Vermont. I saw some people from Efficiency Vermont on the call. What we don't have is sufficient incentive, I guess, for builders to take advantage of those opportunities, those training opportunities. So,
Scott, I know part of your bill was a couple lines sort of that would grant explicit authority to municipalities interested in administering and enforcing the energy code. Have you, through this process, I know we met, a smaller subset of us met in January to talk about that specifically. Have you had any further conversations about that and the existing statutory language and whether that's sufficient to consider municipalities as currently having that authority, or is that still a gray area based on what you know?
Municipalities think, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns thinks that municipalities have that authority already in statute. The Public Service Department thinks it's not clear. So the bill also included clarification, as you say, Zach, about that issue. I don't know. I mean, I think that was one of the parts of the bill that the chair of Senate Natural Resources and Energy was interested in. But again, they've got other things they're working on. It gets to be a whirlwind at the end of the session.
Yeah.
And this week is supposed to be the last week, but it's not going to be. So things are getting frantic. Nobody knows whether the governor's going to veto the budget over the education issues and all of that. So people are pulling their hair out.
Well,
so
thanks for
really
jumping on and giving us a quick update. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And appreciate all your efforts in this space. We've got a few minutes left. I'd say maybe just open it up to the room. If there's anybody who has a question for Ian, speak now or forever hold your peace. And Kara, I believe did you already circulate information about our follow-up discussion, or did you want to mention
I'm going to do
maybe?
it afterwards. I'll send out an invitation for that conversation, which will be June 8th at noon if you want to put on your calendar right now. And then I see Anjanda's hand is up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there is a simple answer to explain who pays for the HERS rater. Is it the homeowner ultimately, or is the state, is Massachusetts paying for it? How is that getting paid for?
Yeah, that's an easy one. The builder or the developer is paying the HERS rater for the services provided. You could argue that increases the cost of construction, although a lot of what the HERS rater is hired to do is to help reduce that cost of construction. So they're sort of value engineering the design, as it were. So saying like, do you really want 2 dormer windows, or maybe you want 1, or maybe you want none, and these are the trade-offs. So the software that HERS raters use now is very much also a cost pricing tool to help them think about cost of construction.
That's good.
But
That's
yeah,
kind of new information for me. I'm wondering if there's been any studies done on that, any data that we could use here in Vermont to really explain that.
It is very difficult to sort of make the case that HERS raters reduce costs, because developers will, it's their job to say, oh, you're just adding cost to us and we need incentives, Certainly with Passive House, like we paid for affordable housing developers to do the study. None of the market rate developers were interested because they didn't want to open their books. But we do have on our Mass Clean Energy Center website 7 completed case study projects for the Passive House costs. Obviously, costs are changing every few weeks these days with whatever, but I still think there's value in understanding the relative costs. And then the soft costs are not zero, like paying for a HERS rater does have a cost, but it's very difficult to then show the benefits. It's just like energy efficiency in general. Like ratepayers might see that you're paying for an energy efficiency program and it's difficult to quantify the benefits. This is the exact same concept. Like you're paying for a HERS rater or a Passive House consultant. It's very difficult to kind of say exactly how much money they're saving the project, but it can be like significant.
Enrique?
Yeah, in the Passive House design process that you do before starting construction, or you can actually tweak all the aspects of the construction, and that's the way that you can first, by reducing all the loads to the minimum, or the thermal loads to the minimum, then you can reduce the mechanicals, and you can reduce, as Ian mentioned, the ventilation as well, and the heating and cooling systems. So that's something that is being done in the design process with the energy model. So that's the advantage of doing the certification, because you do all those things on those calculations prior to starting anything.
Yeah, and I'm going to use that as an excuse to mention another cost savings that we care about in the energy office, which is, so we've talked about savings to the project and to the builder, but also if you dramatically reduce the heating load in particular, then you reduce the cost to connect to the electric grid. And if you are removing gas, then you're also reducing costs on the gas network. So we're seeing, particularly again with passive house, because it's that next level of heating load reduction, that these projects are easier to interconnect. We have a lot of old infrastructure on our electric grid, and utilities saying, well, we need new transformers, we potentially even need new substations for development in some of the areas that we want to put new housing in. And being able to say, well, look, the peak electric load is maybe a third of what it would have been, even with a gas heated building with full air conditioning, which is a requirement now. And it's going to pay in year round because it's using electricity all year, including for better ventilation. Like, we are now working with National Grid in particular, but also other utilities to sort of say, this is adding beneficial grid use that can have downward pressure on electric rates. So it's a little bit of a wonky energy office argument, but it's billions of dollars of investment in Massachusetts.
Richard, last comment or question,
Yeah,
and I
I
think
don't-
we'll wrap it up.
Right, we just haven't been. I mean, I think, and you bring up a great question, and I think, Ian, we need to do a little bit of analysis or research or a paper or something on this impact, the influence of HERS rater engagement in projects and the resulting cost implications. I mean, I've certainly heard this anecdotally from a number of your HERS raters in Massachusetts, but quantifying it and putting it out there, I think, could really at least help us in Vermont and maybe elsewhere justify engaging HERS raters as part of these projects. They don't add costs, they save costs. And that'd be great to somehow figure out how we can do an analysis that quantifies that.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be difficult to scope, but I think the evidence is there all over the place.
Well, Ian, just want to say again, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your knowledge and the Massachusetts experience with us. Really appreciate that. I think we can learn a lot from what you all have done, and will continue to do. So thank you again.